May 6, 1944, Celebes Sea, northeast of Indonesia. Through the periscope of submarine I-52, Lieutenant Commander Kanichi Obari watched the convoy scatter as American torpedoes tore through the formation. His hands trembled as he recorded what he witnessed in the ship's log. This was the third convoy in 2 weeks that American submarines had decimated with surgical precision. The escorts, once confident in their ability to protect merchant shipping, now appeared helpless against an enemy that seemed to know exactly where every convoy would be, exactly when it would arrive, and exactly how to exploit every weakness in Japanese defensive tactics. Above him, destroyer escorts USS George, USS Raby, and USS England prowled the surface with a new weapon that Japanese submariners had learned to fear more than depth charges: the Hedgehog, a forward-throwing spigot mortar that fired 24 contact-fused bombs in a circular pattern ahead of the attacking ship. Unlike depth charges that exploded whether they hit or not, masking sonar contact and allowing submarines to escape in the confusion, Hedgehogs only detonated on direct contact with the submarine's hull. The silence when they missed meant the hunt continued. The explosion when they hit meant instant death. Obari had watched 6 submarines from his squadron disappear in the past 2 weeks, not damaged, not forced to surface, simply erased from existence by weapons and tactics the Japanese Navy had never anticipated facing. What Japanese intelligence officers failed to understand, what senior commanders refused to accept, was that they were facing not just superior technology, but a systematic approach to anti-submarine warfare that transformed every element of naval combat into a coordinated killing machine. This is the story of how American anti-submarine tactics broke the morale of Japanese Navy crews, how technological superiority combined with operational excellence created a threat so overwhelming that experienced sailors began to question whether survival was even possible, and how the invisible war beneath the waves contributed as decisively to Japan's defeat as the island-hopping campaigns that captured headlines. The seeds of Japanese naval demoralization were planted long before the first American destroyer escort ever fired a Hedgehog salvo. They germinated in the fundamental strategic miscalculations that guided Japanese naval planning from the moment war began. The Imperial Japanese Navy had built its doctrine around the decisive battle, the climactic fleet engagement where battleships and carriers would determine naval supremacy in a single day of combat. This Mahanian vision shaped every aspect of Japanese naval thinking, from ship design to resource allocation to the training of officers and crew. Anti-submarine warfare received almost no attention in this paradigm. Convoy escort was considered inglorious work, defensive operations that contributed nothing to the offensive. Spirit the Imperial Navy cultivated. The protection of merchant shipping, while acknowledged as theoretically important, was treated as a secondary concern that could be addressed after achieving naval supremacy. This proved to be a catastrophic miscalculation. When Admiral Thomas C. Hart, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Asiatic Fleet in Manila, received orders on December 7, 1941 to execute unrestricted submarine warfare against Japan, he unleashed a campaign that would eventually destroy Japan's ability to wage war. But the Japanese Navy, fixated on battleship confrontations and carrier strikes, failed to recognize the mortal threat emerging from beneath the waves until it was far too late. The early months of the Pacific War masked the danger. American submarines, plagued by defective Mark 3 torpedoes that ran too deep, exploded prematurely or failed to detonate at all, achieved limited success. Japanese merchant captains, watching American torpedoes pass harmlessly beneath their ships or explode ineffectively against their hulls, developed a dangerous confidence. A saying circulated among Japanese mariners that tankers would not sink if torpedoed. Merchant captains actively preferred sailing independently rather than in convoys, viewing escort procedures as unnecessary bureaucracy that slowed their voyages. This complacency extended to the highest levels of Japanese naval command. As late as mid-1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy had no dedicated anti-submarine warfare organization. Protection of sea communications was handled on an ad hoc basis by units with other primary missions. The first convoy escort fleet was not established until July 1942, and it received only 8 obsolete destroyers for the entire East China Sea. Even then, convoy operations remained optional, Most merchant shipping continued sailing independently, easy prey for any submarine with functional torpedoes. The transformation began in September 1943, when American engineers finally resolved the Mark I Star torpedo's problems. Suddenly, American submarines possessed weapons as reliable as their Japanese counterparts. The sinking rate of Japanese merchant vessels increased dramatically. In 1943, American submarines sank more than 1.5 million tons of shipping. The following year, that number doubled to approximately 3 million tons. By the beginning of 1945, Japanese foreign trade had been virtually strangled, with merchant tonnage declining by more than 60%. But it was not merely the tonnage sunk that demoralized Japanese crews. It was the manner in which American forces hunted them, the inexorable precision that made survival feel like a temporary condition rather than an achievable goal. American anti-submarine warfare evolved into a multi-layered system that exploited every technological and operational advantage available. At the foundation of American success lay signals intelligence, the codebreakers at Fleet Radio, Unit Pacific in Hawaii, successor to Commander Joe Rochefort's legendary station Hypo, routinely intercepted and decoded Japanese transmissions. Convoy routes, schedules, cargo manifests, and even daily noon positions were transmitted in codes that American cryptanalysts had broken. This intelligence allowed American forces to position submarines exactly where Japanese convoys would be most vulnerable. The destruction of Squadron 7 in May 1944 exemplified the devastating effectiveness of this intelligent submarine coordination. When Admiral Somu Toyoda assembled his fleet for Operation Eigo, the planned decisive battle against American naval forces, he ordered Rear Admiral Noboru Owada to establish a submarine picket line northeast of the Admiralty Islands. 7 submarines would provide early warning and whittle down the American fleet before the main engagement. American codebreakers intercepted these orders almost immediately. On May 13th, Fleet Radio Unit Pacific decoded a transmission from submarine I-16, giving its estimated time of arrival off Bougainville. This intelligence was passed to Commander Hamilton Haynes, commanding Escort Division 39, who ordered a 3-ship hunter-killer group to intercept. The group consisted of destroyer escorts USS George, USS Raby, and USS England. What followed was unprecedented in naval warfare. In 12 days, USS England sank 6 Japanese submarines using Hedgehog attacks of surgical precision. The submariners of Squadron 7, experienced officers and crews who had survived years of war, were hunted down and destroyed one by one with an efficiency that seemed supernatural to Japanese observers. Each submarine that disappeared took with it not just its crew, but the confidence of every other Japanese submariner who learned of its fate. Lieutenant Commander Walton B. Pendleton, commanding USS England, had developed Hedgehog tactics to a level approaching art. His executive officer, Lieutenant John A. Williamson, possessed both combat experience and technical mastery of sonar operation. Together, they transformed the England into a submarine killing machine that Japanese crews could not evade. The Hedgehog itself represented a revolution in anti-submarine weapons. Traditional depth charges required the attacking ship to pass over the submarine, losing sonar contact during the critical moments of the attack. The explosions, whether they struck the submarine or not, created massive disturbances in the water that blinded sonar for up to 15 minutes. Submarines frequently escaped during this window of confusion. The Hedgehog eliminated these weaknesses. Mounted on the foredeck, it fired its circular pattern of bombs ahead of the ship, while sonar contact was still solid. The bombs sank quickly, reaching a submarine at 200 feet depth in less than 10 seconds. Most critically, they only exploded on contact. An unsuccessful attack left the water undisturbed, allowing the hunter to maintain sonar contact and immediately launch another attack. The success rate spoke for itself. By the end of the war, 1 in every 5 Hedgehog attacks resulted in a kill, compared to fewer than 1 in 80 with depth charges. For Japanese submarine crews, facing a Hedgehog attack meant confronting a weapon designed to eliminate every escape technique they had developed. Commander Ryanosuke Kato, an experienced submarine officer commanding the picket line from RO-105, employed every evasion tactic in the Japanese playbook during a 30-hour battle with American destroyer escorts. He kicked the rudder to create disturbances in the water. He discharged debris and oil slicks to create false targets. He changed depth rapidly to break sonar contact. He used the temperature layers in the ocean to hide his boat's acoustic signature. Nothing worked. The American hunters maintained contact through every maneuver. They coordinated their attacks with a precision that suggested they could read his mind. When Cato finally ran out of options, 10 Hedgehog charges struck RO-105 at 180 feet below the surface. The contact-fused explosives punctured the pressure hull in multiple locations. Catastrophic decompression crushed the submarine like a tin can, killing all 55 crew members instantly. The psychological impact of such total defeat rippled through the Japanese submarine force. Officers and crew, who had considered themselves elite warriors, masters of underwater warfare, were being hunted to extinction by an enemy that operated with mechanical efficiency. Intelligence reports captured after the war revealed that morale in the Japanese submarine force declined precipitously as the effectiveness of American anti-submarine warfare became apparent. A post-war report prepared jointly by the U.S. and British navies noted that Japanese submarines were spending weeks off the American West Coast without making contacts, finding it impossible to believe that target-rich waters could yield nothing. The reality was that American anti-submarine measures, including extensive patrol operations and code breaking that allowed convoys to avoid submarine concentrations, had made successful operations virtually impossible. The demoralization extended beyond submarines to the entire Japanese naval escort force tasked with protecting merchant shipping. By 1943, the collapse of Japan's merchant marine had become so severe that the Imperial Japanese Navy finally established the Grand Escort Headquarters to coordinate convoy operations. But this belated recognition of the problem could not overcome years of neglect and strategic miscalculation. Japanese convoy escorts operated under crippling disadvantages that made effective defense nearly impossible. Unlike American destroyer escorts that were mass-produced in standardized configurations with the latest anti-submarine technology, Japanese escorts were a hodgepodge of obsolete destroyers, converted merchantmen, and purpose-built escort vessels that lacked commonality in equipment, training, or doctrine. The personnel situation was even worse. The Imperial Japanese Navy suffered from a critical shortage of Naval Academy graduates qualified for command and staff duties. Most escort vessels were commanded by Merchant Marine Academy graduates who, while experienced in navigation and seamanship, lacked tactical training for anti-submarine warfare. These officers had no unified doctrine to follow, no standardized communication procedures to coordinate escorts within a convoy, and often little interest in tactical matters. They were sailors asked to perform combat duties for which they had never been trained. The escorts themselves were technologically inferior to their American counterparts. Japanese destroyers had impressive night fighting capabilities, but their sonar equipment was primitive compared to American systems. Radar, which American forces were using by 1942 to detect surfaced submarines at night, was not installed on Japanese convoy escorts until late 1943, and even then only in limited numbers. High-frequency direction finding equipment, which allowed Allied forces to locate U-boats by their radio transmissions, was never widely deployed in the Japanese Navy. The depth charges carried by Japanese escorts suffered from a fundamental flaw that exemplified the intelligence failures plaguing Japanese anti-submarine warfare. Until mid-1943, Japanese depth charges were set to explode at shallow depths, typically around 100 feet. Japanese forces believed American submarines did not normally exceed this depth. In reality, American fleet submarines routinely operated at depths exceeding 300 feet, well below the effective range of Japanese depth charges. This vulnerability became public knowledge in June 1943 when U.S. Congressman Andrew J. May, following a visit to the Pacific Theater, revealed at a press conference that American submarines had high survivability rates because Japanese depth charges were fused to explode too shallow. Various press associations sent this story over their wires, and multiple newspapers published it. Whether this disclosure actually prompted the Japanese to adjust their tactics remains debatable, but it highlighted how fundamental gaps in Japanese understanding of American capabilities persisted even 2 years into the war. By 1944, Japanese convoy operations had become exercises in futility that progressively destroyed the morale of escort crews and merchant sailors alike. The Takeichi convoy of April-May 1944 exemplified the nightmare that convoy duty had become. Assembled at Shanghai with the mission of transporting the 32nd Division to Mindanao and the 35th Division to Western New Guinea, the convoy comprised 15 transports protected by an unusually strong escort force, including the flagship Shirataka, 3 destroyers, 3 ocean escort ships, 1 minesweeper, 2 sub-chasers, and 3 gunboats. American signals intelligence detected the convoy's assembly, decoded its route, schedule, and cargo, and positioned submarines to intercept. The convoy was attacked repeatedly as it attempted to reach its destination. On May 6th, in a devastating submarine attack in the Celebes Sea, USS Gurnard intercepted the convoy and sank multiple transports. Follow-up attacks by other American submarines over the following days systematically destroyed the convoy. Of the thousands of troops embarked, many never reached their destinations. The transport ships that did survive arrived without their equipment, rendering the division's combat ineffective. Japanese escort commanders, watching their charges die around them, despite their best efforts, faced a demoralizing reality. The Americans possessed better intelligence about convoy movements than the convoy commanders themselves. American submarines operated with impunity, choosing when and where to attack. The escorts' weapons were inadequate, their tactics obsolete, and their chances of survival diminished with every voyage. The introduction of American wolfpack tactics in late 1943 further intensified the psychological pressure on Japanese convoy escorts. Unlike German U-boat wolfpacks, which were large formations coordinated from shore-based headquarters, American coordinated attack groups typically comprised 3 submarines that departed port together and operated under the command of the senior captain. This organizational structure allowed the submarines to develop group tactics while maintaining tactical flexibility. The wolfpacks employed a formation of flankers and a trailer. The flankers would cruise parallel to a convoy's course, sometimes racing ahead in what was called an end-around to position themselves for attack. The trailer tracked the convoy and informed packmates of course and speed changes. Once the first submarine attacked and became the trailer to reload torpedoes, the flankers would press their attacks, overwhelming the escort's ability to defend the convoy. For Japanese escort commanders, wolfpack attacks created impossible tactical situations. Detecting one submarine meant others were almost certainly present but undetected. Responding to an attack from one direction left the convoy vulnerable from another. The coordination displayed by American submarines suggested a level of training and tactical sophistication that Japanese forces could not match. Major Yoshitaka Hori, a senior staff officer with the Grand Escort Command Headquarters who survived the war, analyzed the fundamental imbalance in post-war interrogations. Japanese defensive strategy assumed that inflicting heavy casualties would degrade American offensive capabilities. The convoy escorts did inflict casualties on American submarines, but the Americans simply replaced their losses and continued attacking with undiminished intensity. The submarine force grew from 47 boats in the Pacific in 1941 to 169 by the end of the war in 1945. The mathematics were unsustainable for Japan. Every Japanese merchant ship sunk represented an irreplaceable loss. Every escort vessel damaged or destroyed depleted a finite pool of defensive assets. The Americans, by contrast, were producing destroyer escorts at a rate that exceeded losses by an order of magnitude. The destroyer escort program alone produced over 1,000 vessels during the war years. These ships were specifically designed for anti-submarine warfare, equipped with the latest sonar, radar, and weapons systems, and crewed by sailors trained in convoy protection and submarine hunting. The human cost of this industrial and technological imbalance manifested in the demoralization of Japanese crews who understood they were fighting a losing battle. Captured Japanese documents revealed a naval force in crisis. Convoy commanders filed reports acknowledging that American coordination negated Japanese advantages in individual ship or crew quality. They noted that American intelligence appeared to know convoy routes before the convoys themselves departed. They described attacks of a ferocity and precision that made effective defense impossible. The merchant sailors who manned the transport ships and tankers faced perhaps the most demoralizing experience. They sailed knowing that American submarines were hunting them with near-perfect intelligence about their routes and schedules. They knew that the escorts assigned to protect them lacked the equipment and training to effectively counter submarine attacks. They knew that if their ship was torpedoed, survival was far from certain. American submarines frequently attacked convoys at night, when rescue operations were most difficult. In tropical waters, survivors faced sharks drawn to the scene by blood and debris. The sinking of major troop transports created particular horror among Japanese naval personnel. In August 1944, convoy HI-71 sailing to the Philippines lost the transport Tamatsu Maru, which sank so rapidly that 4,041 soldiers and merchant crewmen died. The transport Taya Maru took 2,065 men to the bottom when she sank. In November, submarine attacks on convoy HI-81 sank the transport Akitsu Maru in 3 minutes, killing 2,150 men from the 23rd Division. Days later, torpedoes sank the transport Mayasan Maru, carrying 4,500 men in 2.5 minutes, drowning 3,432 soldiers and crewmen. These catastrophic losses created a ripple effect of demoralization throughout the Japanese military. Soldiers ordered to embark on transports knew they might die before ever reaching the battlefield. Ship crews understood that each voyage might be their last. Escort commanders faced the grim knowledge that they lacked the capability to prevent these disasters, no matter how skillfully they performed their duties. The Japanese Navy's attempt to adapt to American anti-submarine warfare came too late, and with insufficient resources to reverse the tide. In November 1943, the Grand Escort Headquarters was established to coordinate convoy operations and implement standardized doctrine. By April 1944, an escort of convoy headquarters provided a pool of senior commanders available to lead convoys, but these organizational changes could not overcome the fundamental disadvantages Japanese forces faced. The commanders assigned to lead convoys had no experience with convoy operations or anti-submarine warfare. They were implementing doctrine developed in response to crisis rather than built on years of peacetime training and wartime refinement. Their escorts were equipped with sensors and weapons inferior to those carried by American hunter-killer groups. Their intelligence services could not provide the kind of detailed, actionable information about American submarine movements that allowed American forces to intercept Japanese convoys with such precision. By 1945, the demoralization of Japanese naval forces engaged in convoy escort and merchant shipping had become complete. American submarines, supported by code-breaking, advanced sensors, superior weapons, and aggressive tactics, had achieved the kind of dominance that made continued resistance feel futile. The Japanese merchant marine, which stood at 6.4 million tons in December 1941, had been reduced to 1.5 million tons by war's end. American submarines alone accounted for 56% of these losses, sinking 4.8 million tons of merchant shipping and 540,000 tons of naval vessels. The psychological impact of this campaign was as significant as the material losses. Major Atsushi Oi, a former staff officer with the Grand Escort Command, wrote after the war that Japan's failure in anti-submarine warfare had been long predestined. The singular underestimation of the submarine menace, he argued, had influenced Japanese leaders' decision to go to war in the first place. If they had properly understood the vulnerability of Japan's maritime communications to submarine attack, they might have made different strategic choices. The human dimension of this failure manifested in the experience of individual crews who witnessed the systematic destruction of Japan's ability to sustain its war effort. Escort commanders who had believed in Japan's ultimate victory found that belief eroded by each convoy that suffered devastating losses despite their best efforts. Submarine crews who had entered the war as an elite force found themselves hunted to near extinction by an enemy that operated with technological and tactical superiority they could not match. Merchant sailors who had sailed the Pacific for years found their profession transformed into a form of Russian roulette, where each voyage might end in sudden, violent death. The final vindication of American anti-submarine warfare came in the closing months of the war. In June 1945, 9 American submarines conducted Operation Barney, penetrating the Tsushima Strait, using advanced sonar to navigate through dense minefields and entering the Sea of Japan, which the Japanese had considered their private pond. Over 3 weeks, these submarines decimated what remained of the Japanese merchant fleet in waters Japan had assumed were safe from submarine attack. The operation demonstrated the completeness of American dominance in undersea warfare. Japanese forces could not prevent American submarines from operating in any waters they chose. The minefields laid at enormous expense and effort were penetrated using technology the Japanese could not counter. The convoy routes that had been shifted to supposedly safe waters proved as vulnerable as those in the open Pacific. There was no sanctuary, no safe passage, no hope of evading the submarine blockade that was strangling Japan's economy and military. When Japanese naval commanders reviewed the anti-submarine warfare campaign after the war, they universally acknowledged that they had been outclassed in every dimension that mattered. American industrial capacity had produced weapon systems they could not match. American training had created crews who operated those systems with devastating effectiveness. American intelligence had provided targeting information that turned the Pacific into a killing ground where Japanese ships sailed toward prearranged ambushes. American tactical doctrine had evolved rapidly, incorporating lessons learned and disseminating best practices across the submarine force with a speed Japanese organizations could not replicate. The demoralization of Japanese Navy crews facing American anti-submarine warfare was not the result of any single weapon or tactic. It emerged from the cumulative effect of fighting an enemy that possessed systematic advantages in intelligence, technology, training, industrial capacity, and operational doctrine. Each element reinforced the others, creating a system of naval warfare that Japanese forces could not effectively counter, despite the courage and skill of individual sailors and officers. The officers commanding convoy escorts who watched merchantmen die under their protection, despite their best efforts. The submarine crews who faced hunter-killer groups equipped with weapons that eliminated their traditional escape techniques. The merchant sailors who manned ships knowing that American submarines were tracking their movements with intelligence derived from broken codes. All of them came to understand that they were fighting not just against individual American ships or submarines, but against an integrated system of warfare that exploited every advantage modern technology and industrial capacity could provide. This was the reality that broke the morale of Japanese naval forces in the anti-submarine war. Not dramatic battles or heroic last stands, but the grinding attrition of a campaign where survival became progressively less likely, where each tactical adaptation was countered by American innovation, where the mathematics of industrial production made victory impossible regardless of individual courage or sacrifice. The American anti-submarine warfare campaign demonstrated a fundamental truth about modern naval conflict. In an era where technology, intelligence, and industrial capacity could be fully mobilized and systematically applied, traditional notions of naval combat based on individual ship duels or climactic fleet battles became obsolete. The side that could integrate all elements of naval power into a coherent system would dominate the side that relied on traditional approaches, regardless of the latter's tactical skill or warrior spirit. Japanese Navy crews facing American anti-submarine warfare learned this lesson the hard way. They discovered that courage without adequate weapons was insufficient. That skill without supporting technology could be overwhelmed. That tactical excellence without strategic resources led only to defeat. And that demoralization came not from any single catastrophic loss, but from the cumulative recognition that they were fighting an enemy whose systematic advantages made their eventual defeat inevitable. The tonnage sunk, the ships destroyed, the lives lost. These statistics told the story of Japan's defeat at sea, but the demoralization of the sailors who witnessed this systematic destruction, who understood the futility of resistance against an enemy that possessed overwhelming advantages in every dimension of naval warfare, revealed the human cost of Japan's fundamental strategic miscalculation in challenging American naval power in a war of industrial attrition. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of World War II's most decisive yet least publicized campaigns, please like and subscribe to our channel for more stories of the men who fought beneath the waves and the technology that determined their fate. The silent war of the submarines shaped the Pacific conflict as profoundly as any battle fought on land or sea. And understanding that invisible struggle reveals dimensions of the war that traditional histories often overlook.